In this compelling story, we follow Sarah Collins, a respected FBI agent, as she encounters a harrowing experience on a dark, stormy night. Stopped by Officer Turner, a local policeman with deep-seated biases, Sarah faces unjust treatment and hostility. The situation escalates, revealing Turner's prejudice, but it also becomes a turning point as he is forced to confront the painful truth of his actions. Sarah's strength and Turner's journey towards self-awareness create a powerful narrative about the need for accountability, respect, and the courage to stand up for justice. Before we dive into this gripping tale of courage, prejudice, and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this powerful, thought-provoking story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain poured heavily as Sarah Collins navigated through winding roads, her car headlights cutting through sheets of water cascading from the sky. The small, quiet town she was driving through was hardly recognizable under the dark, stormy sky, with barely a soul to be seen. This wasn't the sort of night anyone would choose to be out. But Sarah had been at the office later than planned, sorting through files and finalizing a report for a case she'd been working on tirelessly. Now all she wanted was to get home to her family, slip into comfortable clothes, and let the night's tension melt away. Sarah was an FBI agent known for her dedication and skill, but tonight she looked more like a regular traveler than a federal officer. Dressed in jeans and an oversized hoodie, she had hoped to go unnoticed on her drive home. She hadn't anticipated any need for her badge or the authority it held. After all, this was just a simple drive home, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the rain continued its relentless drumming on her car roof, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. The town was silent. The streets barren. It was eerie. The only sound, aside from her car's tires splashing through puddles, was the rhythmic beat of the rain. Every so often she'd glance at her GPS, reassuring herself she was on the right path, close to finally being home. Then, she noticed it. A pair of headlights glowed faintly in her rearview mirror, slowly drawing closer with each passing minute. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just another car on the same road, making its way through the storm. But as the lights drew nearer and nearer, a flicker of anxiety crept into her thoughts. This was an isolated area, especially on a night like this. She couldn't help but wonder who else would be out in such terrible weather, and why they seemed to be following her so closely. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her body tensing as the car closed in behind her. A cold shiver went down her spine when she saw the blue and red lights flash on, filling her car with an ominous glow. The vehicle was a police car, and its lights were unmistakable. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was driving at a safe speed, staying in her lane, and obeying all the traffic signs. But she knew that, even when you've done nothing wrong, a police encounter can sometimes be more about perception than actions. And being a black woman in an unfamiliar, predominantly white town, she couldn't help but feel a hint of apprehension. She glanced at her bag on the passenger seat, where her FBI badge was tucked safely inside. The thought of showing it to the officer crossed her mind briefly. Perhaps it would diffuse any tension or prove that she was trustworthy. But another part of her warned against it. Some people saw her badge and only grew more hostile, as though her position were a threat to their authority. "Stay calm, Sarah," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the rain. This was just a routine stop. She tried to assure herself. Maybe the officer needed to check her license or give her a warning about something. After all, she'd done this before and faced far worse situations in her line of work. But this time, out in the middle of nowhere with a lone police car following her through a deserted town, something about the situation felt different, heavier, almost personal. She thought about whether to keep driving or to pull over right away. The rain seemed to fall harder, as if urging her to make a decision. Then the officer's siren blared, jolting her out of her thoughts and leaving no doubt. He wanted her to stop, and he wasn't going to wait. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she flicked her turn signal and began to slow down, pulling her car off to the shoulder of the road. The sound of the rain grew louder in her ears, each drop like a drumbeat pounding out a warning. She forced herself to stay composed, taking slow, deep breaths to steady her nerves. She could handle this. She'd faced far worse, but a small, persistent fear lingered in the back of her mind. As her car came to a stop, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest louder than the rain. Sarah sat motionless, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel as she glanced into her rearview mirror. Through the thick rain, she could just make out the silhouette of the officer stepping out of his patrol car. He moved slowly, purposefully, each step seeming to echo off the wet pavement. The officer's face was partially obscured by the downpour, but his posture radiated a certain sternness, maybe even hostility. Sarah had been in situations with power-hungry officers before, but the feeling of isolation on this dark, empty road made her acutely aware of just how alone she was. The officer came up to her window and tapped on the glass, his flashlight casting a harsh glare. Sarah lowered her window slightly, just enough to hear him over the rain. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice rough and lacking any hint of politeness. Sarah nodded calmly, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her purse in the passenger seat. She was cautious, knowing all too well that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. Retrieving her license and registration, she handed them over, her gaze meeting his with quiet confidence. The officer took the documents, barely glancing at them before looking back at her. His gaze was hard, unyielding, and filled with suspicion. He scrutinized her as though searching for something to justify his actions. "What brings you out here?" he asked, his tone thick with distrust. "You don't look like you're from around these parts." Sarah held her composure, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. "I'm just passing through, officer. Heading home after a long day at work," she replied, keeping her voice steady and respectful. The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly dissatisfied with her answer. "Work, huh? And what kind of work do you do?" Sarah hesitated for a brief moment, weighing her response. She knew from experience that some officers grew resentful when they discovered her line of work, but there was no point in lying. "I'm a federal agent," she said, her tone firm yet unpretentious. "I work with the FBI." For a split second, the officer seemed taken aback, but he quickly masked it with a mocking sneer. "FBI, huh? Sure you are," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gave her a once-over, his eyes sweeping over her casual attire. "What's an FBI agent doing out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that?" he asked, his tone accusatory, as if her clothes alone were enough to prove she was lying. Sarah fought to keep her frustration in check. She knew this could escalate quickly if she wasn't careful. "I'm just trying to get home, officer," she replied, her voice calm but tinged with a hint of exhaustion. She hoped that answering simply and directly might ease the tension, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. The officer leaned in closer, his face now inches from hers through the open window. The cold rain dripped from his hat and jacket, and his expression hardened further. "I don't like your attitude," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "And I sure as hell don't like you thinking you're above the law just because you claim to be with the FBI. Now you'd better start explaining yourself, and fast." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to show any hint of fear. She'd been trained for situations like these, to remain composed under pressure, to think clearly even when emotions ran high. But this felt different. It wasn't just a routine stop. It felt like a test, a game of power and control. "Officer, I'm not trying to be difficult," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her patience was wearing thin. "I've shown you my ID and my registration. I'm simply passing through. There's no reason for this to become a confrontation." The officer's face twisted with rage, his expression darkening as he leaned even closer. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. His hand rested on the grip of his weapon, a clear and chilling reminder of the authority he wielded. Sarah met his gaze, a quiet defiance in her eyes. She was well aware of her rights, and she knew that she hadn't done anything to warrant such aggression. But she also knew that refusing to comply could make things even worse. "Officer," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I've done nothing wrong. There's no reason for me to step out of this car." The officer's eyes flared with anger, his grip on his holster tightening as he spat out his response. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" he demanded, his voice a harsh bark in the quiet of the stormy night. Sarah held her ground, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not refusing anything, officer, but I'd like to understand why you're asking me to get out of the car." Her composure seemed only to fuel his rage. His face flushed with anger, and his body language screamed frustration at her unwillingness to cower. He was used to people submitting, to being the one in control. The fact that she was standing her ground, especially as a black woman in this isolated town, seemed to enrage him even more. Without another word, he yanked her car door open, the force of it shaking the entire vehicle. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as he reached in, grabbing her arm with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain shooting up her shoulder. She stumbled as he pulled her out, the rain drenching her within seconds as she struggled to keep her footing on the slick, wet pavement. The cold rain mixed with a surge of adrenaline, sharpening her senses as she resisted the urge to react. She knew that any struggle would only escalate things further. But the way he was handling her, the unnecessary force, the disdain in his eyes, made her blood boil. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady even as anger bubbled beneath the surface. She wanted to shout, to demand that he let her go, but she knew that doing so would only worsen the situation. But the officer wasn't listening. His grip tightened, his face twisted with an almost palpable hatred. "Shut up," he snarled, shoving her roughly against the side of her car. The cold metal pressed against her back, and she winced at the pain radiating from her shoulder where he'd grabbed her. Sarah gritted her teeth, fighting to keep her resolve intact. She had faced criminals, dangerous suspects, and high-stakes situations throughout her career. But this was different. This wasn't about her being an FBI agent. This was about the color of her skin and the power this officer felt entitled to exert over her. As he forced her down onto the ground, her purse slipped from her grasp, its contents spilling onto the wet pavement. She watched as her keys, a few receipts, and a small tube of lipstick scattered across the ground. And then she saw it, her FBI badge, gleaming dully under the streetlight, lying just inches from where the officer stood. At that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The tension in the air grew thick, almost tangible, as Officer Turner's eyes fell on the small metallic badge glistening on the pavement. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't even breathe. His gaze locked onto the badge. The letters FBI shone clearly, unmistakable proof of who Sarah was. Her credentials were right there, dispelling any shadow of a doubt he might have had. Sarah, still on the ground, felt her breath catch as she watched his expression shift. She saw the momentary flicker of recognition in his eyes, quickly replaced by something she could only describe as fear. His entire demeanor shifted, the authority he had so forcefully wielded suddenly evaporating as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. For a brief, silent moment, neither of them moved. The rain continued to pour around them, each drop striking the ground with an intensity that only heightened the scene's suspense. It was as though time itself had paused, allowing them both to comprehend the gravity of the situation entirely. But then, almost as if snapped from a trance, Turner took a step back, his face growing pale. He looked at Sarah, then at the badge, and then back at Sarah. His grip on her arm loosened as he stumbled over his own words, his voice a shaky whisper. You're really FBI?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She took her time, slowly pushing herself up from the ground, maintaining eye contact with him the entire time. Her gaze was steady, cold, and unyielding, filled with a controlled fury that spoke louder than any words could. She didn't rush to pick up the badge. Instead, she let him absorb the total weight of his mistake. Turner's confidence and aggression all seemed to drain away as he stared at her, a look of horror slowly dawning on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, as if he were struggling to find an explanation that could justify his actions. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Her voice was calm, yet laced with an undeniable edge. "Yes, officer," she said, her tones steady and sharp. "I am an FBI agent." Turner's face flushed, his earlier bravado utterly gone. The words he had spoken to her, the commands, the accusations, now hung in the air like a noose around his neck. He tried to backtrack, stumbling over his words as he attempted to explain himself. I didn't know. You weren't showing your ID, and you You weren't cooperating, and I thought—" Sarah cut him off with a look, her eyes flashing with a wave of quiet, controlled anger. "You didn't know," she repeated, her voice cold and steady, each word deliberate. "Or you didn't care to know?" Turner flinched at the words, and the truth in them hit him harder than any accusation she could have made. He glanced away, unable to hold her gaze. Sarah could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the dawning realization of what he had done, who he had done it to, and why he had done it. He was a man trapped by his own prejudices, and now those prejudices were unraveling right before him. "I thought," Turner stammered, his voice weak, almost pleading, "I thought you were someone else. You weren't complying, and I thought—" "What exactly made you think I was a threat?" Sarah asked, her voice calm yet firm. "Was it because I was driving through your town at night? Or because I don't look like I belong here?" Turner's mouth opened, but no words came out. There was no good answer to her question, no justification he could offer that would make his actions any less reprehensible. He looked down at his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to process the weight of his actions. But Sarah wasn't done. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You didn't ask questions," she continued, her voice low but powerful. "You didn't assess the situation. You saw what you wanted to see, a black woman who didn't belong, and you acted on that without a second thought." Turner swallowed hard, his face now drained of color. The reality of his actions was settling in, heavy and inescapable. He looked as if he wanted to respond, to defend himself somehow, but there was nothing he could say that would make this right. He had crossed a line, and now he was being confronted with the ugly truth of his actions. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. But even he seemed to realize how hollow the excuse sounded. Sarah's expression didn't soften. If anything, her eyes grew colder. She held up her badge, letting him see it clearly, its metallic surface gleaming under the dim streetlight. "Your job is to protect and serve," she said, her voice sharp with a quiet fury. "Not to harass and intimidate innocent people because of the color of their skin. And tonight, officer, you failed miserably." Turner's hands shook slightly as he reached for his radio, seemingly unsure of what to do next. His career, his life, and everything he'd built seemed to be slipping through his fingers as he stood there in the pouring rain, the reality of his actions weighing down on him. Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. She knew that the power had shifted, that the tables had turned, but she also knew that this was far from over. Turner was terrified, and rightly so. But she wasn't interested in his fear. She wanted him to understand the damage he had done, the way his actions had affected her and countless others before her. "Officer Turner," she said finally, her voice calm but commanding, "you need to think long and hard about what you've done. This isn't just about tonight. It's about every life you've impacted, every person you've treated this way. And whether or not you understand that, there are consequences for your actions." Turner's gaze dropped, his earlier arrogance now replaced with shame and regret. He knew she was right, knew that he had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. He had always justified his actions as doing his job, but now that justification felt like a flimsy shield, one that had finally shattered. The rain continued to pour, soaking them both to the bone. But as Sarah stood there, her FBI badge in hand, she felt a clarity she hadn't felt all night. She had been pushed to her limits and tested in a way that was both personal and painful. But she had stood her ground. And now, as she looked at the man who had tried to strip her of her dignity, she knew that his reckoning had only just begun. Without another word, she turned away, leaving him standing there in the rain, a broken man forced to confront the consequences of his own actions. Bookmark, go back. As Sarah walked back toward her car, the world around her seemed muted, as though even the rain had softened its relentless drumbeat out of respect for the scene that had just unfolded. She felt her soaked clothes clinging to her, each step weighted by both the cold and the emotional strain of what had just occurred. But she remained steady, never once looking back. She knew Turner would still be standing there, frozen in place, consumed by the realization of his own prejudice and the power he'd misused. She paused by her car door, the rain tracing rivulets down her face and arms, mingling with the ache that had settled deep in her muscles. Her mind returned to the moment when Turner's grip had tightened around her arm, his fury nearly palpable. The power dynamics of that confrontation had flipped entirely when he spotted her badge, but she couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if that badge hadn't been there. Suppose she had been just another woman, just another face to him, anonymous, vulnerable, and without the protection of a title or a federal agency. Taking a steadying breath, Sarah finally lifted her badge, wiping away the water droplets that had gathered on its metallic surface. It felt heavier in her hand now, as if the incident had somehow infused it with the weight of every past encounter, every unjust action Turner had imposed on others in similar situations. She'd seen it too many times, officers hiding behind their badges, wielding authority to maintain control rather than protect. Turning back toward Turner, she noticed he was still watching her, his expression no longer angry but hollow, almost broken. The arrogance and bravado that had filled his stance moments earlier had vanished, replaced by a growing shame that seemed to twist his features. His eyes fell on the badge in her hand, his gaze transfixed as if it represented everything he'd feared at that moment: accountability, exposure, and the end of unchecked power. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but laden with a quiet intensity that cut through the rain and silence. She wanted him to fully comprehend the magnitude of his actions. For her, for every person he'd wronged, and for the countless others who would inevitably cross paths with officers like him. This was about more than just her. Turner looked away, unable to meet her gaze. His shoulders slumped, a stark contrast to his earlier aggression, and he seemed at a loss for words. He stammered, searching for an explanation, an excuse, but each word that attempted to leave his mouth fell short, silenced by the truth reflected back at him in Sarah's eyes. I didn't realize," he muttered, barely audible over the rain. He sounded weak and helpless, even as he struggled to justify what he had done. But the hollow words only deepened the silence between them, as neither he nor Sarah believed for a moment that his lack of realization was any excuse. Sarah took a step forward, closing the distance between them, her eyes unwavering. She needed him to understand that this wasn't just about her badge, her position, or even the law. This was about humanity, respect, and the right for every person to exist without fear of being targeted or marginalized. And it was about the inherent responsibility that came with the uniform he wore. A uniform that should have symbolized protection, but, in his case, had come to represent something much darker. "You didn't realize?" she repeated slowly, her voice steady. "Or did you simply not care to see me as anything other than a threat?" Her words sliced through the air, each syllable carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Turner flinched, his face contorting with a mixture of regret and humiliation. He was at a loss, visibly shaken, as he grappled with her words. He'd held the power to control, to intimidate, and to strip away dignity, and he'd wielded it without a second thought. Now, in the cold grip of reality, that power was slipping from his hands. Sarah watched as the fear in Turner's eyes gave way to something more vulnerable, more painful. He seemed almost defeated, as if confronting the man he'd allowed himself to become was a punishment in itself. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as he choked out, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." A bitter smile crossed Sarah's lips, one filled not with joy or triumph, but with the exhaustion that comes from having to fight for something as basic as respect. "Didn't mean for it to go this far?" she echoed, her tone cold. "Officer Turner, you didn't care how far it went. You saw what you wanted to see, a black woman who in your mind didn't belong here, and you let that dictate everything." Her words struck him with the force of a revelation he'd long tried to bury. He'd seen himself as a protector, someone who kept the town safe and maintained order. But Sarah's words shattered that illusion, revealing the uncomfortable truth about his so-called protection, a protection that excluded those he deemed different or unworthy. The silence stretched on as Turner stood there, his head bowed, rainwater streaming down his face. The weight of Sarah's words, combined with the image of her badge lying on the wet pavement, seemed to crush him under an invisible burden. He'd always prided himself on his job, his position, and his authority, But now those very things felt hollow, stripped of their value. Sarah took one last look at him, her gaze filled with a silent, unyielding message. She could see he was struggling, caught between the man he believed he was and the man he now realized he had become. There was no escape from the truth. He had abused his power, and he was finally being forced to confront it. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. Turner remained rooted in place, his gaze following her as she moved away, his expression one of regret and dawning comprehension. He'd been brought face to face with his own failings, forced to see the ugliness of his actions. As Sarah opened her car door and prepared to leave, she could only hope that the impact of this encounter would leave a lasting mark, a reminder that respect was not something he could choose to withhold or abuse. She climbed into her car, her hands still trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She took a moment to steady herself, breathing in deeply, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. She knew she'd done everything in her power to stand up not only for herself but for every person who had ever been mistreated, judged, or targeted simply for existing. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a stand against the prejudice and fear that had fueled so many abuses of power. As she started her engine and drove away, the rain continued to pour, washing over the town and everything in it. In the rearview mirror, she caught a final glimpse of Turner, standing alone in the middle of the road, his figure slowly fading into the storm. The man who had once seen himself as a bastion of authority and strength now looked small, lost, and humbled. For Sarah, the night's ordeal had left her weary but resolute. She knew that this was only one battle in a much larger fight, one that required persistence, courage, and a refusal to accept anything less than respect and justice. She was determined to carry on, to ensure that moments like this would continue to spark change, no matter how small. And as she disappeared into the darkened horizon, leaving Turner and the storm behind, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. A promise to herself and to every person who had ever been silenced, a commitment to fight for a world where everyone was treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the town wrapped in an eerie, heavy silence. Officer James Turner woke to a gray, cloud-covered sky, the events of the night before replaying in his mind. The words Sarah had spoken, laced with such controlled anger and disappointment, echoed relentlessly, haunting him. The sight of her FBI badge lying on the wet pavement was burned into his memory, a reminder of the line he had crossed. He dressed in his uniform, his movements slow and burdened. It felt different today, like armor that weighed down his every step. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety he couldn't shake. He was no longer certain of the respect and authority he had once taken for granted. When Turner arrived at the police station, he noticed an unnatural quietness among his colleagues. Normally, the morning would be filled with casual conversations, jokes, and laughter echoing through the halls, but today, the atmosphere was tense. His colleagues avoided his gaze, whispering in hushed voices that ceased whenever he walked by. The air was thick with judgment, and the walls seemed to close in around him. Summoned to the chief's office, Turner's heart pounded, his throat dry as he took a seat across from his superior. Chief Reardon was a seasoned officer known for his no-nonsense attitude and strong sense of justice. Today, however, his face was expressionless, a blank mask that betrayed none of his thoughts. "Sit down, Turner," Reardon said, his voice flat and devoid of any camaraderie they might have once shared. Turner sank into the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady himself. He could feel his stomach knotting, the gravity of the situation sinking deeper with each passing second. He knew that he was about to face the consequences of what he'd done, and there was no way out. The chief opened a file on his desk, his eyes scanning the pages before he finally looked up. "We've received a formal complaint from Special Agent Sarah Collins," he began, his tone cold and professional. "She detailed the events of last night, and I've reviewed the body cam footage. Let me make this clear, Turner. It's not good." A wave of nausea hit Turner as the reality of his situation crashed over him. He had known, deep down, that his actions the previous night were indefensible, but hearing it spelled out like this brought an added weight. There was no escape from what he had done, and now he would be held accountable. The chief continued, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were printouts of news articles, headlines emblazoned with words like racism, abuse of power, and FBI agent harassed by local officer. Turner's stomach churned as he flipped through the pages, each headline more damning than the last. The media had already latched onto the story, and the scrutiny was fierce. His name was being tarnished, his actions exposed to the world, and he felt a sinking realization that things might never go back to the way they were. "The department is under a microscope now," Reardon said, his voice thick with disappointment. "And frankly, we can't afford to have this kind of behavior go unchecked. You're being suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Depending on the outcome, you may be facing more than just disciplinary action." The word suspended echoed in Turner's mind louder than anything else the chief had said. All his years of service, the respect he had commanded, the authority he had wielded, all of it was slipping away from him, reduced to a single word that tore at the very fabric of his identity. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but he knew there was no defense for what he'd done. His reputation, his career, everything he had once been so proud of, was unraveling right before his eyes. As he sat there in stunned silence, Chief Reardon's gaze softened slightly, a hint of pity creeping into his eyes. "Mark," the chief said, his tone softer now, "I don't know how you're going to come back from this, but if you do, you'd better be a different man." Turner could only nod numbly, unable to find the words to respond. He felt like he was in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't bear. The chief's words lingered in the air, a final judgment that left no room for argument. As he left the office, the walk through the station felt like a walk of shame. His colleagues avoided his gaze, some looking at him with open disdain, others with a cold indifference that stung even more. The whispers followed him, each one a reminder of the respect he had lost, the reputation he had shattered. Outside, a crowd of reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing as they spotted him. The questions came fast and furious, voices overlapping as they hurled accusations and demands for answers. He shielded his face, pushing through the crowd with a sense of desperation. The respect he'd once commanded had dissolved, replaced by contempt and judgment. As he drove away from the station, the town he'd once seen as familiar and welcoming now felt foreign and hostile. He could feel the stares of the townspeople, the whispers of disapproval that followed him like a shadow. For the first time, Turner felt truly alone, cut off from the community he'd once served. Back at home, the silence of his house was suffocating. He sat alone in his living room, the weight of his suspension pressing down on him like a physical burden. The familiar comforts of home now felt hollow, filled with the echoes of Sarah's words and the bitter realization of what he had become. He replayed the events of the previous night over and over, each memory a painful reminder of his actions. Sarah's calm defiance, the way she'd looked him in the eye and called out his prejudice, it all gnawed at him, tearing apart the image he'd once held of himself. He had always thought of himself as a man of the law, a protector, but now those beliefs felt hollow, stripped of meaning. In that quiet, empty room, he found himself forced to confront the ugly truth he'd spent years ignoring. His actions had been driven not by duty but by bias, by a deep-seated prejudice he'd refused to acknowledge. He had used his badge as a shield, a weapon, wielding it against those he saw as different, as threats. And now, that same badge felt like a weight around his neck, a reminder of the power he had abused and the lives he had impacted. As the hours dragged on, Turner's thoughts grew darker. He couldn't escape the guilt, the shame, the overwhelming sense of failure. He had spent years hiding behind his authority, justifying his actions as protecting the town. But now he saw the truth for what it was. He had let his own fear and prejudice dictate his actions, and he was finally facing the consequences. He realized with painful clarity that his actions had done more than tarnish his career. They had betrayed the very values he'd once sworn to uphold. And as he sat there, alone and defeated, he knew that the path forward would be anything but easy. For the first time, he found himself at a crossroads. The easy path would be to retreat into bitterness, to blame others for his downfall. But another, harder path lay before him, a path of self-reflection, growth, and maybe even redemption. But as he weighed his options, Turner knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice he made, it would define the rest of his life. While Turner faced the harsh reality of his choices, Sarah was already back at work, her mind and heart focused on a broader mission. The events of the previous night had shaken her, but they had also reignited her commitment to justice and equality, a commitment that had driven her throughout her career. For her, this was more than just a personal confrontation. It was a glimpse into a larger, systemic issue, one that had harmed countless people like her. Sitting at her desk, Sarah glanced at her badge, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the morning light. In her line of work, that badge represented a promise to protect and to serve, but also a responsibility to challenge injustice wherever it was found. She had become an FBI agent with the hope of making a difference, of standing up for those who didn't have the same protections or resources. Last night's encounter had reminded her just how important that mission was. As she sorted through case files and reports, Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Turner. She could still see the look in his eyes, the mix of fear and shame that had surfaced when he finally recognized his own prejudice. It had been a powerful moment, one that revealed the uncomfortable truths about power and bias in law enforcement. But Sarah knew that Turner's transformation, or lack thereof, was not her responsibility. Her focus was on the larger picture, on ensuring that people like him were held accountable and that the system itself was challenged and improved. Later that day, Sarah attended a departmental meeting focused on community relations and law enforcement practices. Sitting in a room filled with agents, detectives, and administrators, she listened to the familiar conversations about protecting the community and upholding justice. But this time, those words felt hollow. She could see the gap between the ideals they spoke of and the realities she had experienced the night before. When the floor opened for comments, Sarah raised her hand, her voice calm yet unwavering as she addressed the room. "We talk about serving the community," she began, "but we need to be honest about what that means. It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about earning the community's trust, about making sure everyone feels protected, not just some people." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Sarah continued, her gaze steady. "I had an experience last night that reminded me how easily our positions can be misused, how easily power can be abused. It's not enough to say we're here to protect. We need to ensure that our actions match our words, that our commitment to justice is more than just rhetoric." As she spoke, she could see her words striking a chord with some of her colleagues, while others shifted uncomfortably, their expressions guarded. She knew that change was difficult, and that confronting bias and prejudice wasn't something people did willingly. But she also knew that these conversations were essential if they were to create a safer, fairer system. After the meeting, Sarah was approached by a senior agent, Agent Martinez, who had been with the Bureau for decades. Martinez had seen the Bureau go through countless changes, from policy shifts to major reforms, but his expression showed a deep respect for Sarah's words. "Collins," he said, his tone thoughtful, "what you said in there, it needed to be said. We've got a long way to go, but it's voices like yours that push us to be better. Don't stop speaking up." Sarah nodded, feeling both grateful and resolute. She knew that her journey was far from over, but moments like these reassured her that there were allies within the system, people who understood the importance of accountability and integrity. Over the next few days, Sarah continued her work, balancing her responsibilities as an agent with her mission for reform. She began to advocate more openly for training programs focused on bias awareness and de-escalation, initiatives that could help officers and agents understand their own biases and prevent situations like the one she had faced. She spent hours researching, gathering data, and preparing proposals to present to her department, determined to make her voice heard. At home, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her to this point. She thought about her family, her friends, and the community that had shaped her values. She remembered the challenges she had faced as a Black woman in law enforcement, the moments of doubt and frustration that had tested her resolve. but she also remembered the strength she had found within herself, the unyielding commitment to justice that had kept her going. One evening, she sat with her close friend and fellow agent Marcus, who had known her since their early days in training. Marcus was one of the few people who understood the weight Sarah carried in the battles she fought both inside and outside the bureau. "You're taking on a lot, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice filled with concern. "This isn't an easy fight. You're going to face pushback, resistance, maybe even hostility." Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and determination. "I know, Marcus, but I can't just stand by and let this continue. I didn't become an agent to turn a blind eye to injustice. I became an agent because I wanted to be a part of the solution." Marcus nodded, his expression one of admiration. "Just know that you're not alone in this. There are more of us out there who want to see things change, who believe in what you're fighting for." As they sat in comfortable silence, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't fighting alone. There were others who shared her vision. Others who believed in a world where justice wasn't selective, where authority wasn't a shield for prejudice. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that meaningful change was rarely easy. With each passing day, Sarah felt her resolve strengthen. She continued to push for reform and speak out against the systemic issues she had witnessed. She knew that not everyone would be receptive and that some would see her advocacy as a threat, but she also knew that staying silent was not an option. For Sarah, this was more than just a job. It was a calling, a purpose that demanded courage, persistence, and an unwavering belief in the power of justice. She was determined to keep fighting, to keep pushing for a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As she looked out over the city from her office window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of calm settle within her. She knew that her work was far from finished, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because for Sarah Collins, justice was not just a word, it was a way of life, and she would continue to fight for it, one step at a time. As days turned into weeks, the memory of that stormy night remained vivid for both Sarah and Turner. But while Sarah was channeling her experience into advocacy and reform, Turner found himself standing at a crossroads he never expected. For Turner, the suspension had been an unsettling wake-up call. Stripped of his badge, the symbol of authority that had once felt like his entire identity, he was forced to confront a side of himself he had long ignored. Alone in his home, cut off from his familiar routines and the validation he once received from the uniform, he found himself slipping into introspection, haunted by Sarah's words. Each day of his suspension brought a new wave of realization. He could no longer brush aside the thoughts that gnawed at him. The memories of faces he'd regarded with suspicion simply because of the color of their skin, the countless interactions where he had wielded his authority without thought for the person standing in front of him. For years he had rationalized his actions as doing his job, convinced that he was upholding justice. But now, he could see that he had allowed his own biases to color his judgment, to cloud his vision of what justice truly was. One evening, Turner found himself staring into his own reflection, the weight of guilt etched into his expression. He looked at himself, really looked, and saw not the protector he had once imagined, but a man who had let fear and prejudice twist his sense of duty. It was a hard, painful truth, one that left him feeling hollow and ashamed. He thought back to Sarah, how she had stood tall despite everything he'd thrown at her, how her strength had forced him to confront his own weakness. She hadn't backed down, hadn't let him intimidate her. And in doing so, she had exposed the cracks in his own self-image. For the first time, he saw himself through her eyes, and what he saw made him question everything he thought he knew. As days passed, Turner began to see a path forward, one he had previously refused to consider. He realized that if he truly wanted to make amends, he would have to confront the root of his behavior, to examine the beliefs he had internalized and the prejudice he had accepted. It wasn't enough to regret his actions. He needed to change, to commit to a path of accountability and growth. His first step was seeking out resources on racial bias and community policing, reading materials that he had once dismissed as irrelevant to his job. He attended seminars and workshops on bias and empathy, experiences that opened his eyes to the ways in which he could have approached his work differently. He was beginning to understand that justice was not about power or control, but about service, respect, and the willingness to see each individual as worthy of dignity. One afternoon, as he was leaving a workshop, Turner saw a flyer for a community event focused on healing and reconciliation. It was an event led by activists and community members, a safe space for individuals to share their experiences with law enforcement and to foster understanding between police and citizens. A few weeks ago, he would have avoided such an event, seeing it as a threat to his authority. But now, he felt an urge to attend, to hear the voices he had ignored for so long. At the event, Turner listened in silence, as people of all ages, races, and backgrounds shared stories of hurt, fear, and frustration with law enforcement. Each story was a reminder of the impact that prejudice and abuse of power could have, and how trust could be shattered with a single interaction. He felt a mixture of shame and empathy, recognizing that he had contributed to the very mistrust they spoke of. But he also felt hope, a sense that, by acknowledging his mistakes, he could start to be part of the solution. When his turn to speak came, Turner took a deep breath, his voice wavering slightly as he addressed the room. "I'm here tonight because I've made mistakes," he began, his tone sincere. "For too long, I hid behind my badge, using it as a shield instead of a symbol of trust. I let my own biases dictate my actions, and I know now that those actions caused harm." The room was silent, all eyes on him as he continued. "I can't undo the pain I've caused, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to understand how I can be a part of rebuilding the trust I helped break." As he finished speaking, there was a pause, then a few nods of acknowledgement from the crowd. It was a small, tentative step, but for Turner, it marked the beginning of a journey he was finally ready to take. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the fight for justice would be long, and that changing hearts and minds was no simple task. But she was encouraged by the signs of progress she saw, by people like Turner, who were beginning to recognize the need for change. She didn't expect perfection, didn't expect that everyone would understand her fight, but she knew that even small steps could lead to big change. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued to push for policy reforms within her agency, advocating for training programs that emphasized empathy, de-escalation, and cultural sensitivity. Her persistence earned her both respect and resistance, but she remained undeterred, her vision for a fairer system clear and unwavering. One day, she received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Turner, a handwritten note expressing his gratitude and his determination to change. He wrote about the steps he was taking, the workshops he was attending, and the conversations he was having with the community. He admitted his past mistakes openly and shared how he was working to rebuild himself, one day at a time. For Sarah, the letter was a reminder of the impact one person's courage could have. She had stood up to Turner, not out of anger or revenge, but out of a desire for justice and change. And now, she could see the ripple effect of that choice, a ripple that had begun to touch the lives of others. As she folded the letter, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that her work was far from finished, that there would be more challenges and more nights filled with doubt, but moments like these made it all worth it. It was a reminder that change was possible, that every act of courage, every stand taken for justice, had the power to transform lives. In her heart, Sarah knew that this journey wasn't just about her, or even about Turner. It was about creating a world where people could live without fear, where justice was truly impartial, and where everyone was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. As she walked back to her desk, she carried with her the quiet strength of that vision, ready to keep fighting, knowing that even the smallest victories could light the path toward a better, fairer world. This story shines a powerful light on the impact of prejudice, the danger of unchecked authority, and the strength it takes to stand up against injustice. Sarah's journey is a reminder that each act of courage, each voice raised for what's right, creates ripples that inspire and drive change. She held true to her values even in the face of adversity, showing us that respect and justice are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. On the other side, Turner's awakening serves as a hard, honest look into how deeply biases can shape our perceptions and actions. His path to self-awareness and accountability wasn't easy, but it was a vital step toward redemption and perhaps genuine transformation. Together, Sarah's resilience and Turner's moment of self-reflection present a crucial lesson. Change begins within us. By acknowledging our flaws and embracing growth, we can break down the walls of prejudice and help create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and respected. If you found this story inspiring, press 1 in the comments. If it truly moved you, press 2. We'd love to hear your stories and thoughts, so don't forget to share them below. And make sure to subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories. Share your reflections on this journey in the comments.